Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you happen to be today. Welcome along to the latest in our webinar series. Today we're going to talk about growing employee engagement. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Graham Gerstenberg, I'm CEO of Magical Learning. Very excited to be on the webinar with you this morning and looking forward to sharing some information with you. Before we dive into the formal content, I would like to start today's session by acknowledging the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, culture and community. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. Okay, we have quite a bit to get through in the next 45 minutes. Again, excited about you being on the webinar. If you're relatively new to Zoom, there's a toolbar towards the bottom of the Zoom window that has a couple of important buttons. One of those is the chat button. So I'll be inviting you to get engaged with us throughout the webinar. Some questions I'd love to get some answers from you on. If you have any questions that you would like to ask of me, feel free to unmute yourself during the webinar, but I'm also happy for you to use the chat box and I'll keep my eye on that as we're going through. The outline for today's webinar, we're going to start by just talking a little about employee engagement. What does it actually mean? What does it look like? We're also going to explore why it's so important, particularly in the context of organisations that exist around the world in 2020. Interesting times. We will talk about some of the costs of low engagement for your organisations, how that can be costing you, your teams, your business. And we're also going to provide some tools and techniques, so 5 specific tools for helping to improve employee engagement within your organisation. Before we jump into all of that, I'd like to start with a question. I'd love to hear a little from you about what you're hoping to take away from the workshop today. So again, I'll give you a couple of minutes now to either feel free to unmute yourself and share with us through your mic, or you can pop your answers into the chat box. So I'll give you 2 minutes now to answer that. When people are financially invested, they want a return. When people are emotionally invested, they want to contribute. Quote from Simon Sinek, the theme throughout this webinar is emotional engagement or investment in our organisation, in our business. Happy Wednesday. It's a good thing I'm wearing a bow tie. It makes me look slightly less foolish. Or perhaps it doesn't, I'm not sure. Okay. So let's talk about what employee engagement is. One definition from an article in Forbes magazine. Employee engagement speaks about the emotional commitment an employee has to the organisation and its goals. So some of the signs of an employee being engaged in their work is that they actually care about their work and their company. Caring about something is not just an intellectual endeavour, it's an emotional investment. They are not there just for the pay or promotion. So, you know, remuneration, getting a good wage, getting a pay rise, getting promotions, all of that is important, absolutely no question. But if it's the only reason that I work for the organisation I work for, that's a problem. Because over time, I simply literally will attach the work that I do to the money that I earn. There is no other reason for me being there. So over time, I only make decisions about my work based on what's in it for me financially. If I can get past that and I can find an emotional attachment to what I'm doing, money and recognition and status and promotions, etc., are still important, but they're not the primary drivers. Engaged employees work towards the organisation's goals. And again, this in part comes back to buying into why the organisation exists. And they use discretionary effort. And I like the idea of discretionary effort. So in English, it literally means engaged employees will make decisions on the fly where there's an opportunity for them just to give a little more, to do something a little extra. And it's not always working longer hours. It could be making themselves available to help another team member, a colleague, or perhaps offering to help somebody who works in a different part of the organisation, but they can see that they're struggling. It could be sharing ideas, thoughts they have about how to improve the organisation or processes or systems. It could literally be just staying back an hour later, on a Friday afternoon to get an important job done, rather than just finish and head home for the weekend, because they know it's important, and again, because they are engaged in it. Another way of thinking about employee engagement, and this is from OC Tanner, from a global study that they ran a couple of years ago, it is the level to which an employee cares about their work. And again, there's that caring thing, there's that emotional thing. So if I'm just going through my day, I rock up to work, whether I'm literally leaving my house or whether I'm just working from home. But if I'm rocking up to work every day and I'm thinking about my work and I'm sort of doing it, but there's no attachment, so it's like my heart's closed to the organisation I work for, then I'm not as engaged as I could be. And that will show up in a whole manner of ways. Some of the reasons employee engagement matters. Study after study, the Gallup organisation have been doing a global survey for about 19 years. And one of the things that they study is employee engagement and the impact it has on businesses. And this is not the only one. There've been a lot of studies have shown that increased employee engagement triggers an increase in profitability. So if I'm an organisation where profit is important, if I'm a private sector business, employee engagement is hugely, hugely important. Improve retention rates. When I have an emotional investment or attachment to the organisation I work for, I'm far more inclined to be loyal. So, and generally there's that shared sense of loyalty anyway, but improved retention rates is also important. So the organisations don't have to spend as much time and effort and energy and resources in replacing staff who leave because they don't really like working there. Boosting workplace happiness, it sort of goes without saying. If I'm emotionally invested in the work I do, I sort of like being there. I like doing the work that I'm doing. And there is that ripple effect. It only takes one person in a team to start to lift the rest of the team up if that person is really engaged in what they do. Higher levels of productivity, again, and this in part for me comes back to that idea of discretionary effort. That engaged employees will dig in just a little deeper. We'll put in that extra effort to help build or boost productivity for the organisation because they believe in doing that. There's also often more innovation because if I'm more engaged, I'm much more inclined to be thinking about how can we improve? How can we do this better? How can I serve better? How can I help my team? How can we all improve? More connected employees. The engagement thing is not a solo thing where I'm an engaged employee, but I'm really just engaged in what I do and I'm not really interested in anyone else. Being more engaged means being able to communicate better. I can empathise more with other colleagues, and I absolutely am more open to collaboration. Better communication, again, across teams, across the organisation, more collaboration, a deeper commitment to the organisation from the employee, and also improve recruitment rates. So one of the interesting things that happens in an organisation where employee engagement builds and builds over time is the organisation becomes known as an employer of choice. So we actually have people looking, it's almost like you have people knocking on the door saying, I've heard great things about your organisation, I'd really love to come and work for you. That's where you can get to. So it's not just keeping staff you already have, it's having people literally knocking on the door saying, please hire me. Again, there have been stories of organisations who literally have had people turn up and say, look, I will work for nothing, just let me come and be part of what it is you're doing, it is amazing. Again, the good thing about all of this is that we can help our organisations get there if they're not there already. Some other interesting information around employee engagement. I mentioned Gallup earlier. They do a global survey every year. So the 2017 survey showed that, and this was a global survey, 15% of employees in the organisations that were surveyed, 15% were engaged at work. Again, if we go back to the definition, so we're talking about people who have an intellectual and emotional investment in what they do, why they do it in the organisation. 15%. Australia, New Zealand, it was actually low, it was only 14%. 67% of employees are not engaged. 67%, 2/3 of the people who rock up to organisations are not really engaged in the work that they do. It sort of sounds like they're there for the pay packet. It's actually, again, it's worse in Australia and New Zealand. Based on the Gallup survey, 71% of employees across Australia and New Zealand are not engaged at work. So it becomes a pay packet. It's like, I need the money and I'll do the absolute minimum that I need to do to get through the day and get my money at the end of the week or the end of the fortnight. 18% of employees are actively disengaged. Now, this active disengagement is manifests itself often in people who sabotage. It's the passive aggressive behaviour. It is the rotten apple in the basket, or just that one team member who actively seeks to do damage because they've really, and this is a really good example of an emotional repelling of the organisation. So they are emotionally, it's not even disengaged. They deeply, strongly believe that they don't want to be there, but they need the money, so they'll turn up, but they hate it. And for whatever reason, they don't have the tools or the courage or the wherewithal to decide, this is terrible, I need to be somewhere else. So they just keep turning up. Fortunately, Australia and New Zealand, the stats are a little bit lower, but still around 15% of people actively disengaged. The Gallup study put the estimated cost to organisations globally at $7 trillion a year. It's just stunning when you think about it. And we can look at this and say, well, I can't influence that. That's too big. You know, I don't really care about the rest of the world. I just care about my organisation. So before we jump into some of the things that you can do to perhaps start to improve that, I'd love to hear from you. Again, feel free to unmute yourself if you're on the Zoom call, or perhaps drop your thoughts into the chat box. You're thinking about your organisation at the moment, and where would you score the level of employee engagement? 0 to 10. 0 is it's the worst place in the world to work. 10 is everybody is awesome, everything is awesome, and we have people knocking on the door saying, I want to work with you for nothing. Where would you score your organisation at the moment, and why? I'd love to hear from you. Well, great comment, thank you. A 9 out of 10. Yet to have people knocking on the door to work for free, but it's great in every other way. Thank you, I appreciate that. I'd like to think that no one would actually score their organisation a 10 out of 10, because that also suggests that it can't get any better, but that's a beautiful comment, thank you. Okay, let's move on from unexpected phone calls. Another great quote, I really like this one from the poet Malika Nura. A person who feels appreciated will always do more than what is expected. Appreciation doesn't have to cost money. Immensely powerful. So why do we have low engagement in organisations? What is it that causes employees to disengage, to not really turn up, focused on giving everything? And one of the things that can happen, and this is possibly more prevalent at the moment because of everything that we're experiencing on the planet with COVID-19, some of the racial disruption and unrest, etc., that's happening in the US. But all of the change, you know, jobs being lost, businesses closing down, employees being told either you don't have a job anymore or you have to work from home. And in some parts of the world, we sort of moved, we feel as though we've moved through the worst of the COVID pandemic, and organisations are now looking at opening up again, but they're also starting to get pushback from a lot of their employees who are saying, well, actually, I really love working from home. So yeah, I don't think I want to come back into the office. In the push to get things done, when we're busy, when we've got a lot on, when we need to achieve, when we need to be able to tick the boxes, one of the challenges for all of us is that we start to see the people around us as resources. We start to think about them as resources, not as human beings, not as people. That fundamentally changes the way we think about them, the way we communicate with them, the decisions that we make about what's possible and not possible for them. and they pick up on that, both whether it's overt or covert. So if I feel that I'm being treated or thought of as a resource rather than a person or a colleague, that's a problem. That erodes trust. And if trust is eroded, that leads to a whole bunch of other things. So be really mindful, even when you're extreme. In fact, when you're really busy is probably the most important time to remember to think about and treat your colleagues, your team as people first, not as resources first. Another cause of low engagement from employees is just poor management and leadership. Sometimes we don't necessarily have the right people in management or leadership positions who have the necessary skills, experience, knowledge, etc., to be able to lead people effectively. Another can be lack of career path or lack of growth opportunities. So if I feel as an employee that I'm working in an organisation that doesn't really value developing me, so they don't spend any money on my training, and I don't really have a clue, if I'm not doing this job in this organisation, there's no other job that I know of that I could do. So the way I think about it, I'm sort of stuck in this job. Well, that doesn't excite me. As human beings, we all like to grow. We all like to learn, to develop. Some of us have much greater appetites for that, but fundamentally, it's an important part of being human that we have opportunities to grow. Salary, pay, money, it is important to most of us. It's important to me. So the idea that we don't work for money or that we don't care about the money doesn't apply to the vast majority of us. So it is important. And it's something that we do need to recognize. Again, if you have a lot of employees, each of those may have different needs or expectations around salary, for argument's sake. We have to be aware of that. Lack of recognition is huge. I mentioned a quote from OC Tanner earlier. They published the results of a study last year, a global survey, where they found that lack of appreciation, employee appreciation was the #1 factor, the #1 growth indicator for organisations in the survey. That when the organisation executives are asked, what's the one thing that you feel is going to drive your organisation forward, is going to help your organisation grow, it was employee appreciation. And it's also, not surprisingly, one of the more important factors or causes of low employee engagement. If I don't feel recognised, appreciated, valued, we don't like this as a human being, let alone put me in a workplace and ask me to do work and still don't recognise what I'm doing. So massively important. And low trust is also another where, again, fundamentally, if I don't trust you as an employer, if I don't trust the people in the organisation I work with, it's almost impossible for me to engage emotionally. There will be barriers between me and the organisation because I don't trust. I'm not prepared to be vulnerable to open myself up to people that I don't trust. A really good indicator of that was Google's Project Aristotle. So Google ran this project over about 18 months. And fundamentally what they were trying to understand was, what is it that makes some of our teams perform so much better than some of our other teams? What they'd originally thought was, if we just get all the really smart people in the room, the ones that have got 4 or 5 PhDs and brains the size of a planet, and we throw all of the free resources at them and we give them net pods and slippery dips and free food and everything else, then they'll perform like you wouldn't believe. So they spent 18 months, they looked at 120 odd active teams at the time, they interviewed hundreds of people, and what they found was that wasn't even in the top 5. So what they found was the #1 contributing factor to teams performing exceptionally well, psychological safety. Or if you want to break that down into a nice simple 5-letter word, it's trust. The #1 factor. There've been so many other people who've found the same thing in studies on successful organisations. Patrick Lencioni in the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, somebody else whose name escapes me right now, that's terrible. Trust is so important. So important. Psychological safety. The second was dependability. Can we depend on each other? If I'm an engaged employee, this is the discretionary thinking, discretionary decision making. If I'm engaged, there is a level of trust there automatically. And I feel that I can depend on the people around me. And because I care about my job, I want them to depend on me as well. The third one, interestingly, was structure and clarity. Number 4 was meaning. Again, why do we do what we do? If I can't buy into why we do what we do, if I don't see any real or don't have a sense of meaning or purpose in the work that I'm doing, then I'm probably just there for the money. And the impact thing is also hugely important, as it turns out. As human beings, we want to feel that, or we want to know how what we're doing for our organisation actually impacts. So let's talk about some of the tools that are available that you can perhaps start to use, if you're not already using them, to build more employee engagement in your organisation. And just recognise that you can do this, so you can build employee engagement from the ground up. It absolutely is possible. It's not necessarily the easiest way, but it's still fundamentally possible to do it. We can, as leaders of a team, create, if necessary, a buffer between the team and the rest of the organisation. If employee engagement everywhere else is low, we can still create a little microcosm. It's like this little secret bubble of awesome employee engagement in our team. And one of the beautiful things about that is if we're courageous enough to do that, that can then have a ripple effect throughout other teams and other parts of the organisation. It doesn't have to come from the top down. That would be better, but it doesn't have to. The first tool is meaning. Meaning is fundamentally more important than happiness for us as human beings. There's been a lot of talk about happiness in the last decade. There've been hundreds of books written. There've been lots of studies done. There's some very, very clever people, some very smart people on the planet who've come up with models, and they've done research projects, and they've spoken to thousands, and they've talked to psychologists and counsellors and CEOs and employees, and they've come up with a whole bunch of stuff around happiness. But ultimately, they also realise that there is a level beneath the happiness thing, which is meaning. So when we can buy into or put or attach some sort of meaning to our work, that is more powerful than just happiness, interestingly. Creating vivid pictures of the future. So get your people engaged in why your organisation exists, or why your team exists, and where are we headed. And one of the things that can happen along the way when you start to, when we start to sort of dig into this, why we exist and where are we going and how are we impacting the world, or just how are we impacting our community. As we start to delve into this, one of the things that can happen is you find some of your team realise, oh yeah, this is really not for me. Yeah, I'm sorry. And some of them will actually start to self-deselect, and that's perfectly okay. One of the beautiful opportunities there is for us to respectfully help them to find another opportunity where they do or can attach to meaning more. So creating, sharing a vision for where we're going, even just at a team level, is important. Helping others to find meaning in the work that they're doing. Now, if they don't have any at the moment, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Maybe they just haven't had an opportunity to stop and perhaps share a conversation about that. So meaning, very important. Number 2, recognition. This is so easy. It can be absolutely free. It takes a little of your time, and it takes just an intention to genuinely recognize and connect as a human being with other people that you work with. Things like real praise, not comparison. So real praise is, Tony, I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate the effort that you've been putting in, particularly since you've been working from home. Thank you. Rather than, Tony, I just want to say, look, you've been working probably twice as hard as Jim, and I just want to say thanks very much for doing that. So comparing one employee with another is not a good thing to do. Real praise. Kind words from direct supervisors. I had a student, in class recently, and he was sharing a story about being promoted to a team leader. Now, he'd been part of the team for 4 years, and then they'd given him the team leader role. And he was a little nervous because they also didn't give him any additional support or say, here's some of the skills that you need to develop as a leader or supervisor. But one of the ideas that he did get from a mentor in the organisation was to just get some Post-it notes, pink, nice colour. And so he took a pad of Post-it notes, went around to each of his colleagues, each of his team's workstations after they'd gone home for the day, and literally just wrote the words thank you, smiley face, and stuck it on the keyboard or on their monitor. That was it. He said the impact that it had on the team was unbelievable. So just kind words, they just need to be genuine, that's it. Collective wins, collective praise. We need to celebrate the wins, but we do it as a team. Peer-to-peer recognition. So another thing that we can do to help grow employee engagement is where we have team members celebrating each other and recognising each other, so that we're not always looking for recognition from our superiors. And another thing you can think about is how to incentivise making others better. So it can become a competition within the team for the team to look at ways to help others within the organisation outside of the team. Random acts of kindness is a beautiful thing. A quote from Sean Acor, and Sean's last book, Big Potential, is an amazing read. Again, very clever guy. Potential isn't about trying to go faster alone. It's about working to become better together. Number 3 on the 5 things that you can do to help grow employee engagement. And that is focus on and celebrate and recognise the strengths of each of the people in the team. Yes, it can be important at times to be aware of areas for opportunity. I don't like the word weaknesses. I think it's pointless. It's also negatively focused. So there are always things, skills, competences, abilities, whatever you want to call them, that we can all develop if we feel the need to develop them. But before we even start looking at those, let's look at our strengths. Let's celebrate our strengths. Let's focus on how we can leverage what we're already good at, individually and as a team. Number 4 on the top 5 tools is provide opportunities for your team to give input, to give you feedback, to make suggestions. The first dot point on the slide there is give trust first. If I feel trusted as an employee, if I feel that you trust me, I am much more able to feel okay in trusting you. I feel safer. If I feel that you don't trust me, I'm not inclined to trust you. If you're the manager or the leader and you give trust first, so you act from a position of, I trust you as an employee until you do or say something to lead me to believe that I should no longer trust you, rather than the old way, which was, well, you have to earn my trust, which is all ego. So trust your people first. Trust them to do the right thing. Trust them to be more engaged. Trust them to come up with ideas that can actually improve the business, even though they're not the boss. Ask for their feedback, but be genuine about it. If you're going to ask for their opinion or their thoughts, stay with them during the conversation. Don't just get on your phone halfway through and say, yeah, no worries, thanks. Learn to value different opinions, different ideas. They don't necessarily all have to work, and you don't necessarily have to agree with them all, but it is important to be open to them. And that, again, is not necessarily always an easy thing to do. And one of the other things that happens when we think about what's going on in our brain as an employee, if I feel that the organisation values my input, they value my thoughts, my ideas about how we might improve the business. They don't necessarily implement all of them, or maybe any of them, but I genuinely feel that they listen and they do value my input. It triggers reward sensations for us in the areas of autonomy and status, which creates an emotional state where we are just that little bit more engaged in the organisation. So ask your team for their thoughts, for their input. Get them involved in the business. Give them the opportunity. Number 5 is almost a no-brainer, except we don't do it enough, and that is celebrate. And it's not celebrate the big things. It's get into the habit of celebrating even the little things. Every small win should be, again, it doesn't have to be a big thing. Let's go out for an organisation-wide dinner or get everyone to, I mean, it's tricky at the moment anyway. It doesn't have to be a big, expensive, lavish celebration. It can literally be the team getting together and just verbally acknowledging each other, giving each other a mental high five or a virtual hug and saying, great job, well done. Some of our clients run daily huddles, and we run a huddle each week, and you can do the same thing in a weekly huddle. Part of the huddle, which is just a team getting together to get focused on what we're doing, why we're doing it, where we're going. An important part of that is everybody gets to celebrate just one thing that they're grateful for, one small win that they had, either in the previous 24 hours or in the previous week. And we all get to acknowledge that. Again, it doesn't have to be big, but celebrating together absolutely forms stronger bonds. And if I feel that even the little wins that I've had are acknowledged and valued by the other people on my team, that increases my emotional connection with the team. So my engagement goes up. And just because we haven't had a quote for so long, it's another one from MLK I wanted to share. It's a great way of thinking about employees. Employees are a company's greatest asset. They're your competitive advantage. Spell check is not my favourite thing, but we'll get to that eventually. And if I could get on my soapbox just for 23.5 seconds, why do we call people talent? I would love to do away with the whole idea of talent management, because it's just for me, completely depersonalized you as a human being. You're not a human being anymore. You're not a person, you're talent. And we manage talent. Sometimes we get too excited and too caught up in the buzzwords thing. People are your company's greatest asset. From a financial perspective, one of the challenges we've had for a long time is the way the accounting system works is people generally are a liability on the balance sheet and they're an expense on a profit and loss. They're still the greatest asset you have. Some of the most successful companies, consistently successful over time on the planet in history, are run by people who understand the value of their people. They put their people first. Southwest Airlines in the US is a great example. Profitable airline company for over 40 years when so many other much larger carriers have gone broke. They put their people first, not their customers, their people. So I'd love to hear from you now. We've got about 5 minutes before we wrap up. What are you currently doing, or based on what you've learned on the webinar today, what are some things that you think you might try to boost employee engagement in your organization? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or share in the chat. Okay, again, thanks so much for sharing that. Really appreciate it. So before we wrap up, I wanted to share some resources with you, some additional resources that we thought might be helpful around this employee engagement opportunity. We will make all of a copy of the slides, etc., available to you after the webinar, so don't feel that you need to write these down now. It's an excellent article on Forbes magazine, really good TED talk by Kerry Goyette on stop trying to motivate your employees and give them opportunities to inspire themselves. And a great book from Joel Manby about 7 timeless principles for effective leaders. So helpful resources, again, we'll send those out to you if you've registered for the webinar so that you have access to those after today. Before we finish up, I just wanted to remind everybody about our ongoing free webinar series. Obviously, this is the webinar for June. For July, we're running one on technology as an enabler for collaboration. And in the context of the pandemic and the fact that so many organisations have had to adapt to having most, if not all, of their staff work from home, how can we use technology to actually boost collaboration across organisations? So that's coming up 15 July. If you are interested in registering for that, if you head to our website, the link's in the bottom of that slide, you'll be able to sign up for that, and we'd love to see you on that webinar next month. So I will open the webinar up now for final questions from anybody. And whilst I'm waiting for those questions to pop up into the chat box or for people to unmute themselves, can I just say a massive thank you to everyone being on the webinar today. I hope it's been helpful. I'm immensely grateful for having the opportunity to spend this time with you. I wish you an awesome Wednesday. Have a fantastic rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you on one of our webinars in future. Thank you again. Bye-bye.